and this is Cole from the American Journal of Healthcare Strategy, and here with me is Josh Pappas. Josh, please introduce yourself.
Hey there, Cole. Welcome. Thanks for having me. I am Josh Pappas. I lead sales and growth here at Kintsugi and excited for the conversation today.
We're so happy to have you on. You've had a really interesting career, all the way starting back at UNC Charlotte, which is also where I got my start as in my educational career. So why don't we just kind of start from there and go all the way through to where you are now? What was your degree in, and what led you to make those decisions early on?
Yeah, it's always interesting because I actually grew up in the Chapel Hill area, right? Tar Heels, Blue Devils, Wake Forest. I was always the odd kid that was a Wake Forest fan, right? So I did a little bit of the opposite where I would have loved to go in there, but I actually went to Charlotte. It was a little bit further away from home and enjoyed it. And so I was a part of sports my whole life. Thought about going maybe somewhere a little bit smaller up in the Northeast. It was too cold. They showed all those, the pictures of the football and the basketball stadium when it was snowing. I was like, oh, that doesn't sound like it's for me. So found a home at UNC Charlotte, was involved in the basketball team my first couple years at there, thought that was the career trajectory to, kind of be involved in sports. It was all I knew, maybe coach, maybe get in on the admin side, and woke up one day and said, you know what, this is a big time commitment. I love it, but I don't know if this is what I want to do for the rest of my career. Right. And so kind of was a student only for the first time, my junior and senior year, right? Because I kind of had that regimented sports school. And so admittedly that junior year, the first semester that I did it, let's not, go back to that transcript and see some of those grades because I probably had too much, flexibility, but figured it out and kind of was in an interesting crossroads where I had to take some certain courses from a athletics perspective. And so I kind of would have been a year behind if I did this, a year behind. So I pushed forward, got my degree in education, had a lot of really great experiences, student taught fifth grade, got to see lots of different areas. And as I was graduating, it was somewhat of a safe career path. I could have got it started, and I was certainly at peace with it, maybe starting different education routes, but had a unique opportunity and interviewed, I would say 50% of my time outside of healthcare sales or outside of education sales, kind of leveraged my network to figure out what else was out there, and really got a cool opportunity interview and had a cool opportunity to break into healthcare sales with a big pharmaceutical company. So that was my foray from there into healthcare.
So, because you started at Takeda, right?
Yeah, so I got a cool opportunity with Takeda at the time, Quintiles, well, which is now since rebranded. And the long story short of that opportunity was kind of by a little bit of a combination of luck, virtue. They were really looking for Takeda was an established pharmaceutical company. They had a lot of really tenured sales reps, and so they kind of tasked Quintiles with let's find nationally for this project some wild cards, right? Folks that maybe had other industry experience, didn't have pharma experience, in some cases didn't have any business experience. And I guess I was right place, right time. I think out of that cohort of 200, there was like 5 or 6 of us that had no experience, right? Just kind of came straight out of school. And so definitely was excited to kind of get the opportunity, but was really fantastic from the two main areas there that I'm really fortunate is one, I got to be a part of a really senior team there at Takeda and Quintiles, right? Folks that had been in the industry for 20, 30 plus years, both on the industry side, but just the healthcare side. That was number one. But probably even more valuable was number two of got a fantastic training program and then started my career on the healthcare side. If anybody knows pharma, of going into doctors' offices, talking with doctors, front office, and really seeing in lots of different areas, big and small, provider group to health system, how really a doctor's office and the whole medical world worked in and out, right? And so I'm really thankful. I'm sure we'll get into it later. I'm really thankful for that opportunity because it really allowed me day to day to see how all of this worked.
I definitely know that perspective from the other side, working in a doctor's office with the sales reps coming in. It does seem like a very challenging role for a lot of areas. but it also seems like a unique role in the healthcare space. So I think that's why our audience is really going to appreciate your message, is because there's these traditional roles that everyone thinks of in healthcare, nursing, being a physician, being an administrator. And a lot of our audience are MHA candidates, but they're looking for alternative roles outside of the hospital, but also still involved with healthcare and still getting that knowledge about healthcare. And that's really what your path is. So you spent about a year and a half there, and then you transitioned to alpha genomics, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
So
did
great.
you
Yeah,
look for that role, or how did that transition happen?
yeah. So I think that's the hardest. Even when I chat with folks, as you mentioned, right, which we can get into, but one of the hardest things for healthcare, I know it seems cliche, is somewhat of breaking into it, right? And there's no, I was fortunate to do that. And obviously, the nice part about some of the MHA and folks is they've done some of the hard part, which is being a part of the wavelength from a healthcare perspective. And I basically realized that amazing opportunity with pharma. I enjoyed the sales aspect of that. And at the time, pharma was a much different version of sales, right? It was much more, frequency, chatting with folks, building relationships, but it wasn't necessarily the sales kind of hunter type sales role that I was looking for, at least in there. And that's where the best way to describe it is I was in and out of different doctor's office. One of the medications that I had was a GI medication for GI induced constipation, right? So I used to joke, I helped launch an antidepressant in depression. So really would walk around in my Ford Fusion and talk depression and constipation all day, right? That's just kind of healthcare joke only that nobody else would get. They looked like I was crazy at a bar or anything like that. But ended up chatting with some folks that were on the device side, thought that that was the next path. It didn't work out that way, but what did work out is staying connected and having a good relationship with those pain doctors. And they said, hey, this guy's up and coming, asking some questions, understanding what was those roles outside of what I was just doing. And basically had some former Boston Scientific device, rep executives that kind of got a little bit more into diagnostics, biotech genetics side of the business, and essentially was connected with those folks and really had an opportunity, I would say, to get in on somewhat of a more startup, right, but not necessarily like you see these software based startups. It was really an opportunity to take kind of a disruptive product that was covered by Medicare in the genetic space and basically work with physician practices in multi different specialties areas on driving adoption for these more preventative cancer testing or pharmacogenetic testing. For me, from a sales perspective, I was kind of given an opportunity at, I was 22, 23 to have my own territory, take something into market, knowing a little bit about what happened, but really having some of those conversations at a regional basis to start from, something from zero to, kind of eventually worked with lots of physicians, managed a team of 5 or 6 clinical folks. I think there's probably some imposter syndrome esque of like, what do I do? What do I know? But it was a little bit of, it wasn't a sexy like cold calling or process. It was showing up to doctor's office that might fit the bill, talking, bringing in lunch, understanding where their challenges was, understanding this was a small part in their overall arena. But from a sales perspective, got to really good opportunity in kind of a 3 to 4 year period of starting something literally from scratch and kind of generating revenue for the business, helping grow something, manage a team, and be a part of that. And so that was a really cool experience that really unlocked a lot of. There wasn't a lot of middlemen, right? There wasn't big company and here and there. It was, our company, our product, our solution, and working with the doctors to go from zero to kind of grow to a really great product, helping out a lot of patients and working with the organizations there.
Right. And then at 20, 23 or 22, that's an incredible learning experience as well that most other people won't get the opportunity to have at that young age. And so what I wonder is, you said that a lot of it was kind of the connections you developed in order to get that role, right? Did you actually send in an application, or was it all based on like, people you knew?
Yeah, this particular example was really based on interviewing for a role actually at Boston Scientific, obviously massive company. So interviewing at med device role, going through that, probably didn't have the qualification. Even with that one, it was doing the formality of it, interviewing for a role. It was like a field marketing role, which wasn't what I wanted to do, but that was my trajectory. Went through a 4 or 5 interview process. Again, of a friendly of folks that I knew, and that's a perfect example. Actually, didn't get that job because after all of that, it went to a decision maker who I was less connected with, and they went with somebody who had more marketing experience, right? But again, I always say it's a great that was a great way to go through that process, and do that. And they said, hey, it's just not a time or fit now. But because of that process, basically, when they were going and this other opportunity come up, they thought about expanding to Charlotte. I was on a short list of folks that they called. So they actually called me out of the blue, said, hey, got your number from X, Y, and Z, would love to meet and understand. They vouched for you, right? And so, yeah, I usually say there's no recipe for that. It's kind of hard when folks are looking at it like, but it's also not necessarily like, hey, knowing all these connections is just going to be an easy way to get, to get a job as well. It's kind of a little bit of putting yourself maybe in as if you want to transition or do that, chat with folks first so that you're not wasting their time, have a point of view around it, and then maybe have some of those uncomfortable experiences where you're going in, you're doing interviews, maybe you get 2 or 3 no's, but in my case, the no turned into vouching for me, and then getting in the interview process. That's really where I was pretty confident if I could just get in the interview process, then I could maybe showcase or do that. And there's no sure things, but that's kind of how that materialized is a no through a formal process too. And that is a big advantage of some of the smaller companies, right? Because at a certain level, you have to go through formalities and process, and there is big arduous process for bigger companies. So if that's something that you want to do, fantastic. There are some advantages there, of smaller companies where it can be a little bit more agile in that regard from a process perspective.
No, of course. And I think that is the thing with bigger companies. Like when I applied through one of my positions, I knew the AVP and the VP, and I knew the CPO, and they all knew me. But then like it has to be signed off by the CFO, and that's when you start, somebody I don't know and I've never spoken with. I think it's really important though that you're just getting done with college and you're building these connections. Lots of people really struggle with building these connections, especially when they go to a school that's not one of the elite top 10 institutions. At Harvard and Stanford and Yale, you're being exposed to lots more executives at these large companies. But you and me went to a school that you don't get as much exposure to that, but you still had an excellent, you know, building of these connections. How did you do that? Where did you learn that skill at that age, that early on in your career to build these connections with these people?
Yeah, I think I had once I was able to enter into it, right? I would always say that, yes, very outgoing, but have enjoyed creating relationships, with folks, even in college or just in general. However, I think I had a lot to learn on great, meet somebody, see what they do. And yeah, if it benefits me, I'd reach back up to them, right? And it was a little bit of getting into that. I realized that these types of connections, particularly in healthcare, are just so deeply rooted. In terms of, hey, I worked together for 30 years, right? And so what I did is I didn't necessarily have, from a familial perspective, any insight on like the business side of anything. My dad taught me. He was a high school basketball coach, athletic director in the state of North Carolina. Relationship wise, taught me a lot, right? I mean, we could go into a barbecue place and, Greensboro, North Carolina, and like my dad would see a former coach player there, and it was kind of crazy. And so I think the lasting relationship piece I had, or I'd seen a model of that. On the business side, I just think that once I got into it, I realized the importance of that, and I realized I had a lot to learn. And so some of it was just an exploration journey of what are people doing? How did they get there? And then I saw in healthcare, it seems like there was a lot of interconnectivity, even in Charlotte, but also across North Carolina and then across, other areas. So to me, the big thing that's changed is now locally, it was super important. But for example, in Charlotte, I realized that healthcare wasn't that big. I would attend some of the happy hours. So actionability, I think that go whatever, city you are and whatever, there are opportunities that you don't know about where folks are meeting, convening, and not necessarily in like a formal way, where they're just talking about, in this case, healthcare technology any areas right there. So I would start there. But the nice thing about LinkedIn and some of these other modalities is if you are in an area like I was where that wasn't front and center, then you can kind of expand that reach there and really start with the idea of love to learn about you, your role, and that's kind of where I saw it expand my network to outside of just what was right in front of me, right? But admittedly, I didn't really have an agenda on the front end, so some of it was I have a lot to learn in this industry, so would love to learn that way. I didn't necessarily have a deliverable in action. I would say the 75% of the time I didn't even have an ask, right? Other than great conversation, use it in your back pocket now, and we can get to it. All those kind of have sometimes come full circle, right? And there's sometimes I would wake up and I'd have like a in-person coffee and I'm like, I don't really want to go this, it doesn't really benefit, I got all these different other things that have stacked up on work, but just doing it and going, I think I've seen those pay it forward significantly, particularly in this kind of niche healthcare, which I'm sure you've seen as well.
You went up through Alpha Genomics. You were there for 4 years. It seems like about every year, every 2 years or so, you got kind of a promotion there. So you did really well. But then you kind of start this next role at, from what I see, Optimize. Oh, my lights just went out. Okay. You start this next role at Optimize Health. And you start this as actually a senior executive role. So
Yeah.
tell us how you got that, how that worked. What was that like?
Yeah, so it's everybody's path journey is different. I think as I got into roles, experiences, and leaders, there was two things that happened, right? Number one, I continued to kind of expose or get exposed to whole new worlds and opportunities that were happening in healthcare, right? And kind of riding this accelerated wave of what was happening in healthcare, as I'm sure you've seen, as number one. But then number two, I've always had to kind of give myself a pulse check of not just staying in a healthcare lane, of like, let me talk to people that are outside of healthcare. In this case, this was around like sales, right? But I just wanted to almost keep myself sane on like, what is that world outside of there? What are people doing? How are companies operating? What are new spaces that exist that could be there? And call it a quarter life crisis. And then the other aspect, as everybody can allude to, at least on the business side of healthcare, is things fluctuate, especially if you're selling a product that has reimbursement tied to it or CMS changes, which the majority do. And you kind of ride this, I would say, wave a little bit where things can cliff. There's the heyday. And so for in that case, the whole kind of genetic space just had a little bit of dip, and so it didn't just affect us; it affected all of the organizations. And so I kind of saw the writings on the wall where it was a 2-3 year period, everything was successful, and then you kind of have to pivot into whatever that next evolution was. And so for me, I wanted to get on the software side. I really wanted to kind of sell software. At the time, I wasn't even saying, hey, I want to sell healthcare software. In fact, I think if you check in with 25, 26-year-old Josh, he would have said, I want to not sell, like, why don't I just sell cybersecurity? Why don't I just
Right.
sell a widget and take people out and, not bang
Yeah.
my head on all the challenges of healthcare? But the nice thing about healthcare, right, is I started on that journey where, if you can imagine, I had a lot of great knowledge and relationships in the Southeast with think provider practices, right? So
Mhm.
one doc groups all the way up to there, different localities, primary care, different specialty areas, cardiology. And I really knew how those systems operated, right? What was key, their pain points. And so, and developed the relationships, cross-functionally there. And so really what happened is, as I did, again, kind of another little exploration of software, I kind of brushed up and met a lot of founders and companies. I would say as these were starting to come into healthcare, right? Of Silicon Valley based company that had some tech to solve X, right, from a
Mhm.
doctor's office perspective. And so I kind of networked with them, and then I realized the missing piece and where I fit in was they had no idea how to even give away software to free to the end user, which in this case was physician practice offices, right? So a lot of those conversations I had, and then the aha moment came where I kind of started out before I joined Optimize as I use quotations on consultants, right? But I started
Yeah.
really playing kind of somewhat matchmaker of knowing some of the challenges around chronic care management software, trying to increase practice revenue there. I knew somebody who was involved in that. Let me set up a conversation, and then you guys take it, from there, right? So I got exposure to what was out there technology wise, but then also to was able to, add value on both ends, and that's kind of how I rolled into Optimize. Is I met those team. They were based out of Seattle. There was a senior leader, one of their first sales hire. So I joined them. If you can imagine from a company size perspective, there's about, I think I was employee number 11. So that's about as close as you get to like Silicon Valley. If you've seen that show on HBO, like super
Yeah.
early stage startup.
Mhm.
But for me, it was also a way to get into software without having to start over from a career path perspective, and maybe join a software company where I had to almost run up the ladder there, right? And so I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just a little bit of a balancing. So I was able to kind of enter the software in a world and space where I already knew how it operated. And then really what it allowed me to do is kind of go on a fast tracked MBA learning of how to sell software. What software is there? What is venture capital? What is Series A, B, C, D, raising money? How does all that fit in, right? In a very condensed period of time, all this is kind of happening in real time. But the core and foundation is I knew how a doctor's office ran. I knew how they operated. I knew and was able to talk with our product team that was building the solution on what was going to work or not work, or what sales process was going to work or not work if we're targeting doctors' offices, right? They don't have time to meet for Zoom on 2 p.m. because everybody's sitting around in their home office just, hanging out. They're seeing patients, right? So there's a
Right.
finite
Yeah.
time, finite information. And so kind of bridging all those worlds together was, was what I did. And so there's no, that was a little bit of I kind of created my role. So it's funny you say from a role perspective is as I've ventured and now been in the startup path, it matters. But I kind of joke, call me whatever you want to call me, right? It usually goes, what stage are we? What are our short term initiatives? What am I responsible for? And chances are it's going to have 6 or 7 things that I'm not on that title to be responsible for. And so, for me, it was really a way that I wanted to enter into software, had an idea of what I wanted to do, and that idea never involved joining a seed stage digital health company, but it was a perfect way of me kind of going through that journey. And so that's how I ended up at Optimize. And we were selling remote patient monitoring technology, which was again the right kind of time and place right before COVID. There was some funding from Medicare, and so it was also, that's the other important consideration, is joining a company where in healthcare, it kind of is right place, right time, right market for who's going to pay for it, how they're going to pay for it, which I'm sure we can get into.
But of course, it's interesting that it seems like, based on kind of what happened afterwards, that this role really started to kind of propel your career forward a lot. You had huge growth that you created while you were there. And then you also got the, of course, invitation to join the Revenue Collective while you were there, I believe, right?
Yeah, so the Revenue Collective is, and you're right, right? So I think there are some of these pivotal moments where it's really hard for folks. It's hard to predict these, but I do think that the way I look at it is, how do I do my own research? How do I, kind of chat with folks and kind of company selection, industry selection, the timing of all that. You can't predict any of that, but there are some kind of entry moments where you do look back and you say, wow, that was a really great call, right place, right time, right? That doesn't mean there's other bad decisions. I don't even think up until that point it was there. But not only did it work out, I was in an industry that was a have to have through COVID. I was in a company who like went through a series, went through a seed to Series A. So I got to see all that, and you're right, right. So it propelled, and then I think startup, the advantages of a startup is you wear multiple hats, roles, and responsibilities, and those timelines really are accelerated. I mean, I can't tell you like. Sometimes I don't recommend people doing that right out of school because it could be daunting, especially if you can get into bad. But 6 months, a year. I mean, so much happened daily, weekly, both from my roles and responsibilities, the exposure of seeing all those, but then also to the industry in general, right? And so you can get kind of a very condensed version of, hey, here's your task in big company, here's your role, you learn it, you work your way up. There's a defined path. There's a, hey, you get to this versus having to deal with so much, being able to cut out the noise, understanding what you need to execute. But in the process, also too, for there, I was just soaking in all this knowledge, terminology, companies, people that I never really did. And I think the connection from an MHA perspective and some of the folks, maybe your audience, is in some ways go out and seek that out, right? Like with somebody like me, or there to just understand there is a whole other side of the world that's not for everybody, because there's probably going to be aspects of that's like, oh my gosh, that does not sound like something I want to sign up
Yeah.
for, right? But
Right.
I think being able to have that exposure to what was out there was really exciting for me. And yeah, basically I kind of came in, was a first sales hire, and created, along with a lot of other folks there, a process where we built up the company, the sales portion of it. We kind of built a process playbook, whatever you want to call it. We did it, we learned, and we kind of helped grow a company. And so I've kind of done that. Kintsugi will be my, fourth kind of company where I've come in early stage, worked with the founders, worked with the early team to build the sales process, sell the product, understand how all this fits in with either a provider, a health system in different areas. And so I enjoy not only selling but the creation portion. And so that was the path that I've taken. Right. So the 2 to 3 year each role in startup years is, oh man, could be much more, because there's just so much that happens there, for better or worse.
Right. And after that, you were first sales hire at Bioformis, and then you became the director of sales at Tendo. And so you've kind of really been on the ground floor, like you said, consistently since then. Why? I mean, for me personally, I have lots of reasons why I prefer startups compared to large corporations. The biggest reason is that nothing wrong with large corporations or the people who work there, but it is much more about accomplishing a task at large corporations. Whereas I feel like at startups, it's about getting something actually done and actually producing value. But why, choose to continue to do that? I'm sure that if you went to work for a consulting firm or a large sales firm, you could probably make a very good salary, have very good benefits. So why choose to keep going the startup route?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe you're in my mind there, because I do think that there's times where it ebbs and flows, and you ask yourself the same question, right? So I think for me, the trajectory was always finding a company or role. But for me, it was, for example, optimized to Bioformis was to level up and sell it to enterprises, right? So similar roles, responsibilities, but they were pivoting and trying to go and sell software into, call it, health systems, or in this case enterprise, so, which is a completely different
Yeah.
sale process, professional way. And so for me, I wanted that challenge. I knew that the product was amazing for, call it, mid-market provider groups. This was a challenge role, well funded, that allowed me to do that and get that experience, and also in a similar space, right? I wasn't starting from ground zero. So I was able to transfer some of it, but also learned of it, leveled up in terms of where I was going. And the nice part about it is that you can have the plans as you go into that hyper growth. There can be a lot of great things about it. There can be a lot of sometimes challenges, because when you're growing at that speed and you're hiring, it's just really hard, right? And so for me, there was some opportunities to continue to do that, do it in a space outside of remote monitoring. But I think for me, I've really figured out that I enjoy working with the founders, working with other companies. And then throughout that too, I think that the other misconception is, when I started at Optimize Health, that was about as startup as you can get, right? Where, like, didn't have health benefits, didn't, you know, was doing there, was driving, sales and growth, right? But at this point in my, call it, professional or personal career age, that was fine, and I had that risk tolerance, right? But there is a misconception where, there's going to be big company, big benefits, big salary, big all of those. But throughout those roles, I think that people would be surprised that from a compensation or benefits, package, even some of the earlier stage startups, Series A, Series B, you can kind of get where you want to be, right? There's definitely trade-offs. I think some of it is much more of a risk tolerance versus there. But I definitely challenge people to go in and don't necessarily think that, oh, if I work for a startup, if I'm at a big company, right, then I'm going to be giving up so much and, you know, compensation. And because it's sometimes there, it really has to do with, to your point, what do you want your days to be? What do you want your weeks to be? How do you measure your personal and professional success? And right, do you really enjoy creating and executing, right? Because a perfect example is that if you come from a big company, there's frameworks, you're iterating, you're being able to do things, but chances are you're not doing things for the first time, right? You're not creating a template that may or may not work, creating a presentation. I mean, for me on the sales side, it seems hard to fathom, but I'm taking a contract, creating the pricing, going to try to get the first iteration of that. It might be right, it might be not, to sell into a health system, right? And so some people, there's some steps for that. They're like, oh yeah, we'll create this, but send me the PowerPoint templates. I'm like,
Hmm.
none of that exists, right? And
Yeah.
so if you're okay doing that, but I think there's some people that like the idea of a startup, and then there's different levels and varieties to that. But when you're super early stage, you're creating, you're executing, so you almost need to have a different mindset of not just, there was a lot, there's been, as I've been through these startups, there's a lot of idea, people, right? And it's great. And you need some of that. The biggest challenge is that there's no shortage of ideas. You kind of need to have a whole team, product, technical, marketing, leadership that is more of an execution mindset. You need people on that team that can execute, but also can execute quickly and realize that if it's wrong, that's the advantage, is right the ship, right? Because I think that's the other idea too, is you can't just keep on executing and be like, oh, let's see it out, let's play it out, right? And so for me, I enjoy that aspect of it. I think it's something that I've done and operated, but in the various different spaces. And so I do. My one advice though is that for folks, I'm glad the framework happened there. I do recommend, there's no linear path, but there are times where coming into a startup too early, right? If you're, let's just say, transitioning from, MHA or on the clinical side, and you want to come over to the startup, or you're at a big company and you want to jump in, or you're right out of school and want to jump in a startup, I hesitate. Everybody's a little bit different, but the challenge is there is that sometimes you don't get the training, the development, the foundations. I feel like I got enough of the foundations, right, to be able to make the judgment one way or the other. But I do, sometimes, especially now, see some folks that are coming right out of university as like a, BDR there. And I feel bad because there's going to be some of the craziness of a startup that almost feels like it should be that way. And there's just sometimes not enough time, energy, effort. The good startups do and have good training and opportunities for personal development. But I do think that that's the one thing I'll caution, is that if you can, sometimes have some of those experiences where you get that foundation, then come in, then you can do both. But just going into it there, to me, would have been, I don't know if I would have been successful had I had that path and haven't had a little bit of that 2 to 3 years of foundation. Don't know your thoughts on
I
that.
totally agree. I've been at Jefferson a while, still am at Jefferson, and I think easing into the startup, going from a little bit of time to more and more time to now working two jobs basically is worked well for me because I'm able to kind of see how the large corporation functions. I'm able to identify strengths, identify weaknesses. I'm able to learn from established leaders, able to get mentorship from CEOs, CFOs, and then apply that to what I'm doing. I think one of the best scenarios is if somebody is bored working for a corporation, I feel like startups offer a lot more mental stimulation, at least for me, because of what you're saying, where it's like you need to create a PowerPoint for a meeting. We at our stage, it's like, what program do we use? Is it an actual PowerPoint? Is it Google? It's like all these decisions, and you have to make these decisions really fast. And you also, people will come up with like really intense questions. Like that's one of the things about the startup that I'm glad also I had experience at Jefferson with, is because at Jefferson, you'll sit in a meeting and some people will have questions about your work or about the quality of your work or how you did it. But when you're in a meeting with an executive for funding, let's say at a startup, they will throw really aggressive questions at you and you have to like really be prepared. And that was something that they didn't, teach me in my undergrad or in business school. So I think that's excellent advice. And I also wanted to ask you about one of the things you had said about the salary and the benefits. Through your career, you've switched every 1 or 2 years, either role or company. Has your salary looked like this, or has it been kind of like that in terms of, going from startup to startup?
Yeah, it's a great point, and from a sales perspective, right? And that's somewhat of an era because I can't speak for other functions, organizations, right? You start to realize, particularly in the startup, that it's somewhat apples to oranges, where you can't really compare, right? And so the framework that I've always tried to use is one, the goal is like not to go, any steps back, but a lot of times the way that, particularly on the commercial side, you're joining an organization for a couple different reasons, right? So for me, it was a opportunity to, I do think I've been here in terms of where I wanted to go of providers into the enterprises. So I've kind of leveled up in where I felt I needed to go. But some of that wasn't like a massive financial. It was just more of where I needed to feel like I needed to go from a learning curve, selling different industries, getting new experiences, et cetera. Right. So starting there. But the sales side of it is really interesting because there's groundwork, there's framework, and then there's on target earnings and commissions. It really is a little bit more of a high upside. There's not necessarily a framework for, I mean, we don't know exactly what revenues are. We don't know exactly how these commercial agreements are going to be structured. We have sometimes various, depending on the size and stage of startup you go, as you get a little bit more mature, it becomes a repeatability, right? Where I've joined these organizations is some of, we have to get in the door, get our products into a Jefferson, just however, knowing that it's going to take 12 months to do it, knowing that the dollars don't necessarily matter. It's proof of concept getting there, which is in some cases, I know some sales folks are like, well, that doesn't sound any fun. I like to know, here's my package. If I sell it and everybody sells, like, and if I sell X, Y, and Z, and here's how I do it, and that's how you make money, and it's a little bit more linear, right? So I do think for me it was understanding that there's going to be a lot of time and effort in learning, but there's significant value in figuring that out. And then there's a combination of short-term compensation, commission compensation, and what I've realized is that sometimes it was understanding what's defined, understanding how it can be defined in upside, right? And then as you go through it and you see, right, it is a little bit, it can be variable in a good way, and then there can be some blockers that are variable in a bad way. But how, a lot of times, if you're adding value, particularly in a lot of my roles, it's just it becomes really valuable for any company, right? The entire organization, product development, a lot of time investors, like it can be a pressure filled role. But when things work, and normally it's not solely because of myself, it's normally that team, but once it starts to hit and work, I think that there are little upsides. There are things like equity, that we can get into. I've always viewed that as icing on the cake, right? I've never taken a role where I'm like, just pay me and sweat equity, right? But you view it as great idea, great business. If this is something in the future, amazing, right? It's kind of additive as long as my core, financial and goals are met. I've been kind of at peace with knowing. And then once you get in there, there's a million things you didn't forecast for. Things can change. Leaders can come and go. Advisors can come and go. And so I've always been, of the belief too, is your direct manager. I do think your direct kind of manager, leader, even if I'm working like a founder or CEO, the, that person is going to make make or break a lot of the day to day, right? So if you kind of are with the leader that you don't necessarily like, that could be fine, but it's going to affect the day to day. So knowing that ahead of time, and then in my case, sometimes that's change, evolve as the business has grown, evolved. You've raised money, and so I've also been able to kind of execute despite that. But I do, like, to me, I've always been in a perfect situation when I'm learning from my leader outside of maybe the company or role, right? You start to have a different perspective on companies, right? And where it's less like, I owe everything to, the shield, right? So to speak, versus I want to do what's best for the company, the business, but I also want to learn things that might transcend, this
Yeah.
one role or company, and that's going to help us out at the there. So a little bit of a long-winded way of answering. It certainly was not linear, and then you start to realize. And then I think the last thing I'll add there is that you start to be okay. I mean, it was really uncomfortable. You start being okay having very direct conversations about things. I think some of this is sales, right? Because I know other industries are a little bit different, but you're really comfortable with having very direct conversations around, here's what I'm worth, here's what this role is, how am I, generating revenue, how am I adding value to the organization short and long term, who am I selling to, am I selling to provider practices, am I, doing business with health systems, because that's like a 12 to 24 month potential sales cycle to get one contract signature, right? Think about the procurement process with Jefferson. And so some of it is just being almost an advocate for yourself, and sometimes things can be taboo around money, right? But particularly there, you almost have to have some of these conversations and evolve it and be willing to say there. That doesn't mean I've always been like, hey, I think I'm worth X, I think this should be there, and they're like, sounds good, great.
Right.
But being able to have the thread and conversation, I think is something that I've learned and leaders kind of taught me to do from a early start of my career. Because if you don't, ask or have any of those, then chances are it's probably going to continue to be status quo. And I do think that, like, companies are big or small, right? I mean, are trying to make business do, going there, right? But I think within those, big companies, right, there are people that are certainly understand that having good employees, having good talent is super valuable, and keeping those folks engaged, happy is going to be the reason for success, both big or small.
Right. And I think that all of that goes back to what we were saying about it. Sometimes it's good right out of school to learn a bit about what's going on first. When I left school, my first two jobs, except the whatever salary they gave me right away, no negotiation, just whatever they gave me, I said, okay, that sounds good. And then it's also the understanding of, when you're first out of school, a lot of people are very focused on like just the money that's actually being deposited into your account. They're not looking at everything else going on within the organization, how they're fitting into everything. So I think those are big things that take a little bit of time to learn. So I think that's very valuable. Your career path has been very planned from what you're saying in terms of the trying to go to enterprise, trying to go, from here to there. I guess what is the reason from going from kind of selling to physician practices to trying to sell to hospital systems and enterprise? And then what is the next step for you? What's coming after that?
Yeah, so I think the whole industry has like evolved overnight, right? Where digital health used to not be anything, and then systems, processes, industries change probably more in the 5 6 years that I've been involved with it than the previous 20 years, right? And so some of that is just kind of being involved in it there, whereas there's other industries, right, that that aren't that way, right, that are a little bit more accelerated and being able to do some of those. So for me, from a role perspective, it is a little bit of staying on top of what's maybe top of mind in terms of initiatives, right? In terms of funding, in terms of, and the nice thing about it is there's just so many good resources on understanding that without, I think it's a much better, particularly for healthcare, where you couldn't read any of that, but now you can, folks Substacks, folks do your own research, YouTube, you can learn a lot of this stuff async. The onus is going to be on you to learn some of this. But I do think what's changed is that you don't have to go talk to people as much like face to face. You can do a lot of this absorbing by yourself on what that is, have a little bit of a point of view on where you think, where your interests lie, what companies might work out. And then I think having that framework makes you, and because it's something that I've done, right, of like talking with folks. And then what you do is when you chat with folks or you're able to do that, I think people resonates much more when you say, hey, I've been doing some research here, I'd love to have this, and they can either confirm, say it is what it is, because you have to be careful, right? Press releases are one thing, deep dives are one thing, but then it allows you at least have an understanding or a point of view, and I think people like that. And that conversation is normally better when you're either confirming or understanding or drilling down on a company or industry. And so that's really what I've done. And then from a job exploration perspective, chatting with a lot of folks in my network, kind of when I was transitioning over from Tendo to Kintsugi, I explored. I kind of did a deep dive of talking with a lot of folks on who are A, companies, B, leaders that they know in their network that they would work for, and then did a little bit of, what was I looking for, right? In this case, I wanted to, maybe pivot out of selling just into health systems, right? Maybe payer, maybe digital health. It's kind of evolved, maybe employer. And so I had a short list of criteria. And then what I did is match up companies, roles, all of that in there, and then talk to people that I trusted on, a little bit of back channeling on what is a good industry, what are good companies, what are there. And so I think it's a good exercise for folks to do. If you're in it, it definitely is a little bit easier to have some of those. But I do think that outside looking in, and I always try, if somebody outreaches me, right, to understand and have a evolution there. Normally I think if you're going into it of like, hey, I want to connect with somebody to maybe intro me to a hiring manager, that can be great. I would view that as like icing on the cake versus understanding, hey, if I were to apply to a role like yours in this company, what would I need? How would I navigate? And I usually try to enjoy connecting with those folks who are proactive on the front end of, maybe doing those. And but you start to see is that the other thing is you have to follow through and execute, because there's plenty of people that, you know, send that message and then don't join the call, right? I wouldn't say plenty, but there are some folks there, and I know life happens in there. But I think generally speaking, folks like myself or others have been in your shoes, and so if you can do that and play the long game there, I think you're going to have a really good, much more success than it's just pass or fail. If I talk to this person, they can't introduce me or put my resume into the queue, then gone to the wayside, right? You probably shouldn't reach out in the first place, in my opinion.
So after that, you've gotten all this information, you've gone through this process, created your list of potential targets that you wanted to work for, talked with all these people. Then you choose Kintsugi. And honestly, I didn't know about Kintsugi until we met at our conference. So even though they had an excellent year last year, they raised I think 20 million, right? Not last year, but in 2022. So what made you choose this organization? Where do you think this organization is going? I guess I'm just kind of interested to learn more about Kintsugi itself, your role there, why you chose it specifically. It is a very interesting and kind of novel idea, and maybe you could explain to the audience what exactly they do and what inspired you about it.
Yeah. So a couple key areas that I'll caution is there's so much. I mean, once you really start digging into it, there's just so much amazing work that's going on, particularly in healthcare now, of amazing operators, amazing technology, amazing founders, teams, clinicians operating healthcare. So it's really rewarding to see that. And not to throw a wet blanket on all of that, but from a company perspective, at least on the sales side, some of it is being able to filter through that to, okay, the flashy and sexy is great, but healthcare isn't just easy as amazing technology. Let's go get a bunch of users and that's fine, right? It still fits in the confines of legacy dated tech systems. You kind of have that layer of insurance in the middle, so it's a little bit easier said than done, right? So if you're looking for amazing tech, I would actually say, you know what, healthcare is amazing. You'd be involved in healthcare, but go to fintech, go to something like you can impact healthcare from a other lens or way, or you could stay in there and guess what? You're still potentially doing good for the world, right? But for me, it was always finding you have a niche of call it subject matter expert in healthcare. And so for me, it was joining an organization. I didn't have like mental health as the top of mind, but in the first part of my career, I was involved with, mental health, right? I sold a pharma drug that was in the mental health space. Some of the stuff with genetic testing, I worked with psych clinics in and out of the Southeast, mental health clinics. And it was just a fascinating and much needed area of focus that was fascinating to me, but also too was really impactful. And I saw and got to work with some of the clinicians on that side. And so as I was kind of really getting down and narrowing down, okay, company agnostic, what am I looking for? I just became really fascinating with the space, the technology, kind of the blend of voice, AI, mental health, and I do think it becomes a little bit easier. Everybody's in healthcare because we want to help, and I've seen firsthand how the technology can help either a patient, a clinician, a provider. Even, I mean, it's crazy. Even in healthcare, that's not like millions of dollars of revenue, right? Which it's there. It's getting this set up at rural blood pressure cuff or remote monitoring rural clinic in middle of nowhere Georgia, right? And seeing, talking with the family, seeing how it's going to impact the connection with the doctor. And so it doesn't take much. And I think that's the key with healthcare is it can be so rewarding when you see all those things, even just work it there. And so for me, Kintsugi was a great opportunity of it fit all of my check boxes on where I wanted to be from a professional perspective. And then as I started digging in, it seemed to be, mental health is top of mind for everybody because it's not just, hey, great, we've cared for everybody's physical health. COVID and all these different areas realized that, hey, even value-based care and all these different other modalities, if we don't cover mental health, costs are higher, right? We're not doing a great job now. And so, but it also matters in terms of a financial, a policy. So it hit on all of those. But for me, it was a really cool opportunity to do something different in a different industry, really fascinating technologies. Because really, what we've built at Kintsugi and the team has built is fascinating technology that's able to take short clips of patient speech, look at some very millisecond level, some subtle changes. This is the amazing power of AI, looking at subtle changes in how we produce sound and speech and be able to correlate that with depression and anxiety, right? So we're able to take the speech, the AI is looking at these millisecond level cues, and we're really able to surface at scale understanding who might be high risk for depression, what level of depression and anxiety they have. And so the real opportunity there, though, is to current state now is one. A lot of times it isn't asked, right, or isn't asked till it's too late, or we're in this problem at the purse. But even still, like a gold standard, right, is these different questionnaires that have been around for 20 plus years that are not objective, sometimes are time intensive and labor intensive. So we're just now getting to the point where that's the gold standard. And so it's almost a really cool opportunity to scale access to starting the conversation around mental health way earlier, stratify. And then the tool is really cool because healthcare is very workflow intensive. So the idea is that we've built, not to use a technical terminology, but we built an API. So we've built a tool that can kind of embed into what already exists in the call center, in the virtual care center, embedded into an app, right? So basically the value prop is, and it resonates in healthcare, is these conversations are happening today, right, in a lot of different areas. How do we layer in a tool to have those same conversations but maybe be able to surface more actionable information around mental health in real time and track how treatments are going over time, but do it in a way that the IT team can say, oh, this is just a very easy plug and play, right? We can do some stuff on the background. It's frictionless patient experience, member experience. So that's the opportunity, right? It is fundamentally a very broad, new way, novel is what it's called. So this is a kind of, it's not just saying, hey, healthcare leader, we have a better way to optimize. We can use technology to optimize this process that you do, right? That's one thing. Or we have better tech. You're using this tech. We can make your tech and it's going to make it more efficient. There's a cost, whatever, but it already exists. A lot of times it can be an exciting conversation, but sometimes difficult is we want you to not necessarily throw away these questionnaires, but we want you to kind of do something that's completely different than what currently exists today, right? And there's no exact knowing how all this is going to fit, but we have to kind of work together to figure out how this makes sense in workflows, where are some of those workflows. So it's fascinating, it's very consultative, but it's been really exciting to be involved in mental health, technology, AI, and so it's been a fun journey so far, but lots of fun work to do.
It really sounds incredible. It sounds very, very interesting. How far do you think it's going to go? Do you expect this kind of technology to be in every, health system?
Yeah, so our focus now is to figure out, kind of lay the foundation for what exists today, where we can help out, short term around some of those value chain areas that we did. And then, oh man, my brain never goes to what it could be, 1, 2 years, right? But I think it's riding a other fundamental area that mental health is going to matter. It does matter, and it's going to matter for a while in the context of we have to address it if we're going to keep people healthy, have healthy transition to value based care. Like value based care without this is just not going to be now. Whether Kintsugi does that alone, chances are not, right? A lot of times, if you think about the construct, there's broader themes around access to care, right? So some of what I can't solve is wait times, right? But there are a lot of companies and innovations that are doing that, and so the opportunity is as there's been significant progress for there. Our main goal is where can we kind of integrate this very seamlessly and make it a little bit of a light switch on or off to almost do it at enough scale where we start to really hone in on maybe it's maternal health, use case to start, right? Where there's a serious issue with postpartum depression. So if we can plug it in there, help out a certain area, then we can kind of define what that looks like. But the mental health, 200 billion in just total cost. I mean, so the cost is there, the opportunity is there, but it is kind of capturing and making sure that this is something that's frictionless, seamless. It adds value. Working with partners, both on the health system side, but payer side, other small digital health companies. We even work with international employers. Right, everybody's kind of figuring out. We're an interesting tool because it's not an app that the clinic downloads. We don't have just this. It is broad, which is great, but really, I think the next couple of years, the whole industry will be defining what might be a possible, but b the actuality of it, and then really honing in on making it a part of standardized workflow, which voice is something that is becoming a little bit more standard of care. You see all these AI scribe companies, and
Yep.
people are comfortable with it. That doesn't mean there's going to be some friction points, but it really has an exciting, like, big picture opportunity of making all of this much more easy to do preventative type mental health wellness, to get folks into levels of care that start with before they get to a psychiatrist. There's just so much great work and helping bridge that for certain MSK or cancer providers. So that's where I'm excited is we can kind of it is a tool of technology that can be scaled quickly, right? If you think about a call center, if it's integrated right, then these call centers are happening in entire organizations to the tune of hundreds of thousands of millions of patients, members, et cetera. And so if this can just kind of help be a part of a broader tool to capture early, get in chatbots, that to me is the exciting portion of it. Is I get to work with cool, obviously clients, but also other cool innovators to be a very important small part of the overall treatment of risking, stratifying on the front end, and then figuring out how this all fits in on the back end.
Definitely. I mean, it sounds like an incredible role and an incredible organization, and I think it's excellent that we met at that conference as well. I think you showcased it. We heard quite a bit about it at the conference, and I think that it's an excellent opportunity for health systems to reduce costs and also offer much better care for mental health, which is something that we're, like you've said, really struggling with. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We're already a bit over time here, so I really appreciate you joining. Well, hopefully, we'll be able to have you on again, maybe with some other guests. Setting up a panel or whatnot in the future would be excellent. But I couldn't be more appreciative, and thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no, really appreciate the conversation. And I always like to, in typical sales fashion, next steps, but really have folks follow up with me. You can find me on LinkedIn, is where I'm probably most active. I'll make sure that you have my email and my contact information, and particularly in your guys' network, MHA folks, feel free to reach out to me. If nothing else, I can usually those conversations go amazing because it just kind of opens up a whole new world of startup and venture capital, how all that happens in the digital health. And if I could even help one or two folks, really look forward to it and excited to see the growth and success that you guys have had, and really enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. We're definitely going to be able to share that with our audience, and I think they're going to really enjoy reaching out to you. Hopefully, they won't flood your email box too much.
It's all good, man. It's all good. Thanks.